The Bones of Iyryl by A.R. Kavli. Read by the author. A stream of digitized signals slid past Beerson Pont's vacant gaze, numbing his mind and senses. Ghostly tracks had been burned into the faded monitor from years of directorate surveillance, just as the years had left gouges in the stained tiles beneath Beerson's chair. The directorate software did a fair job at monitoring the citizens' phone lines for dangerous or subversive language, but it wasn't perfect. It had needed an automation update even before the Gan Plague had put humanity on the endangered species list. Everyone who could have applied the update died choking on their own blood, so now Beerson acted in person as the eyes and ears of the directorate on the wires. His eyes felt sand-filled when he rubbed them, and he was finally forced to look away by the frailties of his flesh. A dull ache throbbed in his wrist, elbow, and back from hunching over to cycle through the different channels by way of an obstinate rotary knob to sample the conversation of unaware speakers. Misshapen stickers with embossed numbers covered the spaces where the original printing had been worn away by countless stiff fingers before his. The long data cord plugged into the jack behind Beerson's right ear trailed across the floor as he pushed the squeaking chair away from the desk. He was allowed to rest his eyes briefly, but the directorate didn't like him unplugging unless on an allotted break. Still resting his eyes, he let his fingers find their way to reach over and flipped to another call. "I just don't think he likes me. I'm always on time, but..." Click. "I'm sorry, Grant. Sometimes I have to work late." Click. 32 credits? That's it? Click. "I saw them, man. I saw the bones. Just like they always said. Sitting there in the monitor, man," said a man's excited voice. Beerson flipped on by the channel out of sleepy habit, then quickly clicked it back when what he'd heard registered. His eyes popped open, and he leaned forward to stare at the screen. The signal was locked on and clear. "Doesn't mean they're the bones of Iyryl," answered a second man. "Come check them out with me. You know that old power plant by work? Right in the basement." The second man chortled. "What were you doing down there?" "You know what. I thought there was some copper maybe, and I was getting out of the rain. But I'm telling you, it was just like what I always heard as a kid." The man's voice had calmed, and he paused expectantly. "You get a close look?" "No, it was real dark down there, and well, to be honest, I got the heebie-jeebies. So I split. Speaking of splitting, I gotta go. I'll show you tomorrow. It's real, man. Say you'll come." "I'm not getting anywhere near it," said Man 2. "If it's a hoax, it's a waste of time. And if the bones are real, and you found them, then I sure don't want anything to do with the cursed things. You need to leave them alone. Those buildings should be condemned anyway. See you tomorrow. At work." The call dropped. Beerson pulled the connection logs, cross-referenced the circuit identifiers, and found the identities of both callers in under 2 minutes. They worked at the tram maintenance garage, 1 block from Power Plant 7, which had been closed down over 30 years ago. The entire neighborhood was flagged as being condemned. He knew it well. He passed by Danner Street, which led to that sector, every day on his way to and from work. The input jack provided an enhanced audio and visual immersion experience, so Beerson didn't hear the echoing clack of approaching footsteps until they were right behind him. He spun, accidentally jerking the plug free, swallowing down the nausea it caused. "Director Thaman," Beerson stuttered. "What brings you down here?" He nonchalantly tapped a few keys to bury the records he'd been investigating on his screen. "Find something?" Just some possible trespassing, sir." The director smiled. Very good then. If that's all, gather the names and forward it to security. I'm sure they can handle it." "Yes, sir." Beerson faced his monitor. He turned back when he didn't hear the clacking of retreating shoes on tile. Director Thaman was looking down at him, brow furrowed. "I would take some advice, Beerson, from that man on the line." Thaman's face broke open in an avuncular smile. "Let it alone, for your own good. Don't go chasing after hoaxes and urban legends. especially not in that part of town. Beerson chuckled. Director, of course not. I wouldn't do something like that. That's what you said last time. Beerson had once tried to single-handedly break up a food theft ring after scanning a series of calls between some wealthy widows. When he had taken it to the directorate, Beerson had been warned away from disturbing them. He went anyway, trusting his instincts and seeing cover-ups in everything. The innocent participants in the surprise wedding shower for one of the widow's granddaughters were nonplussed at his scandalous interruption. Beerson hung his head to hide the blush. He'd known better, but he lived hoping the directorate would someday forget that minor incident. Director Thaman obviously had not, and probably didn't consider it minor. Yes, Director. The director gave a single satisfied nod and patted Beerson on the shoulder. Director Thaman glanced around the room a final time, a look of distaste on his face, and strode away. The clacking of his shoes echoed down the morose, dim hallway behind him. Beerson peered up at the clock on the wall, which showed 2 hours yet to go. The outer casing bore a crack that sometimes got his hopes up by casting the illusion that the clock arms were about ready to sound his release. Beerson gathered up the plug, wiped it off, and jammed it back into his skull. He turned his weary eyes back to the display and reached forward. Click, click, click. Beerson stared down Danner Street again on his walk home. He didn't take much notice of the people who jostled him, and they reciprocated the obliviousness. They carried on like citizens should, not stopping to skylark in the middle of the gray, bustling walkway as he was. Danner Street had been beckoning in Beerson's dreams day and night for 2 weeks since monitoring the conversation about the bones. His wife noted his sulky behavior, including restless sleep and being a half-hour or more late from work every day. Sometimes he felt like he'd woken from slumber, having lost track of how long he'd been staring into the shadows of the complex at the end of that avenue. Everyone in Rileyton had heard a version of the bones of Iyryl in their childhood. It was a haunted place where strange cultists committed mass suicide in the wake of the Gand. The government had rounded up infected prisoners, killed them, and dumped the bodies. Animals, mutated by the virus, had turned into monsters and dragged away hapless victims to strip the flesh from their bones in a secret lair. Uneasy spirits lurked for the living who might come to disturb their rest, offering them an undeniable invitation to join them. Every pack of children had their own telling. Beerson remembered running with his friends through the abandoned steel ruins of his childhood sector, finding stacks of old conduit or rusting rebar and pretending they'd found the bones. He'd even made a serious hobby of investigating sightings and pursuing reports of the bones and other phenomena after moving away from his parents. But life caught up with Beerson, and he traded the mysteries of the bones for the mysteries of women. Thanks to the Gand, there were countless piles of bones all over the planet. Why would the bones of Iyryl, a place he'd never been able to find on any map, be so special? Yet he found himself staring down Danner Street day after day. Heart-racing, Beerson finally realized he would have no rest until he quenched his curiosity. He walked down the street to find Power Plant 7. In 20 minutes, he was in the vicinity of the plant. The pedestrian traffic had already grown very thin, and by the time he made it to the front door and on the phone had spoken of, Beerson saw no signs of life nearby. The lights along the street flickered and buzzed, and the abandoned industrial complex randomly sunk into deep shadows, like a cloaked thief turning away to hide her shame. He tested the door to see if it was locked, and pushed it open with a tremulous hand. The hallway was dark, except for the pale green light cast from the dim exit sign above Beerson's head. His footfalls echoed through the hall no matter how softly he tried to step. At the far end, Beerson found a stairwell leading down, illuminated only by another buzzing green exit sign. He almost turned and fled. If he did, though, Bierson knew that he'd only continue to obsess, so he pushed through the door and stepped off the landing. When he put his hand on the railing, a bolt in the wall snapped, and the whole rail crashed to the floor with a thunderous echo that rebounded into the darkness and back. Bierson bit his fist to stifle a scream and stepped hesitantly down the stairs. It grew darker as he descended. The green exit light above the door on the lower landing was long dead. Bierson groped forward and found a handle and pulled the door open. The hallway beyond was pitch black. The advice of the man on the phone came back to him, seconded by the voice of Director Thaman. He didn't want to encounter any bones down here, real or otherwise, and turned to go, his curiosity overridden instead of sated. The passage wasn't pitch black, however. As Bierson's eyes adjusted, he noticed a faint electric flicker down the hallway. It reflected off what looked to be a small window set in a door. He looked back up the stairwell and judged the distance to the dim light. Rolling up his jacket, Bierson set it on the floor to keep the door to the stairs from closing and tiptoed down the hall. Inside the room he found just what the man had described. There sat a single table with a dim monitor on it, and a dusty, cracked leather chair waiting nearby. Bierson saw the image on the screen and stepped into the room, all fear of the darkness pushed aside. Rows of decayed skeletons on mold-eaten medical tables flickered there. A data cord lay coiled behind the monitor, visible as he approached. "They're real," he whispered. The chair's wheels were so clogged with dirt and rust they skidded instead of rolled as Bierson sat and scooted it in front of the table. A simple joystick control protruded from the monitor. He knew its type well from his work at the directorate and panned the camera view on the screen around. Row upon row of skeletal remains waited in every direction. Some still had tatters of an unrecognizable uniform around the neck, wrists, and ankles. Something behind the camera's view blinked, casting bright green reflections off the shiny domes of the bare skulls. Bierson's breath caught, and he zoomed in on the nearest body. Split insulation dangled from the data cable plugged into the jack set into the right side of the skull, just behind where the ear would be if it hadn't decomposed in its untold ages. He panned to another skull, then another. Each had a similar cable, in varying degrees of decay, jacked in. Zooming out, Bierson could now see that each skull tilted to the left due to the plug, except for those that had rolled off the table when their body crumbled apart. Those skulls hung centimeters from the floor, suspended by their data cables like the start of a game of hangman. Bierson rubbed his finger absently over his own empty data socket. Then, just as absently, his other hand snaked behind the monitor and pulled the cable. The far end was sunk into an unlabeled connector in the wall, so Bierson had no idea what it connected to. He examined the plug and saw it looked new. The skulls blinked in time at him from the screen. He jammed the plug into his skull, and the world around him exploded into darkness. There was no air. His lungs were not moving. Lights flashed in Bierson's vision like a digital kaleidoscope. This was normal when making an immersive connection, but he'd never experienced it so severely. He half expected a timeout error just before it finally completed. It was a terrible connection. After a sluggish eternity familiarizing himself with the system, he discovered it was some sort of utility robot. Bierson could control the two main arms, the clumsy tracks to move around with, and the single input camera on top of the turret-shaped chassis. He could sense there were other functions available, but didn't feel like working them out with a maddening molasses-like speed. When the camera panned around, his vision lagged as if suffering from a hangover. When he tried to move the robot, Bierson felt like he was walking underwater. This was the camera from the monitor where his body sat. Blinking skulls lined up in front of him, grinning up into the darkness. Wherever this place was physically, he knew what it was. Iyryl. With jerky movements, he steered the bot to the nearest skeleton. There was what looked like a name tag on the shreds of uniform. The rib cage crumbled to dust when Bierson tried to move the tag to see it clearly. He let a short cry back in the basement of Power Plant 7. None of the nearby skeletons had readable name tags. The only identification were large faded black numbers stenciled on each side of the beds they lay on. The numbers in the first row ran from 1 to 20, the next 21 to 40, and so on. He could only see 10 distinct rows in the mote-dusted gloom, but more skulls blinked dimly much farther back. Bierson turned the camera to investigate the blinking light behind him. A tall bank of servers winked back with countless LED eyes, but the green light illuminating the skeletons was from a single bright indicator above a dim monitor. The light was labeled Status, and the monitor displayed a list of names. Names he knew. To the left of each name was a blinking green dot in a column named Running. He noted that 5 glowed a steady, baleful red. To the right of each name was a number. All were grayed out with a stern-looking offline caption. They were listed in alphabetical order, last names first. Bierson guided the bot's manipulator and pressed the down arrow on the keyboard to scroll the display. Algiers, Betty, his first girlfriend. Benton, Zach, his childhood best friend. Meavers, Genley, his electronics teacher. Octavio, Lydia, the neighbor down the hall he and his wife had over for dinner just 2 nights ago. Pont, Bierson, himself, or so he used to think. Missing from the list were Alan and Molly Pont, his deceased parents. Left of his name, a banner labeled In Transition blinked in cautious yellow. To the right was a gray 299. Bierson turned the robot and trundled interminably through the tomb of metal and plastic. 100, 200, 250. The robot rolled to a stop at bed 299. The skull rested flat on its chin, staring into the darkness, surrounded by a scree of bone shards from a rib cage that had collapsed in on itself long ago, or had maybe been pushed in. 3 thin lines ran in the dust next to the skeleton as if drawn there. Bierson traced a parallel line with the bot's finger. They were identical. Bierson, came a voice in his distant ear. It sounded distorted and muddy. Come back, Bierson. He worked his way through the disassociation exercise he'd learned to drop in immersive connection. Somewhere in a faraway place, the place where he was sitting, Bierson pulled the plug from his skull. Even the disconnect seemed to take a lifetime. The lights were on, and he had to cover his eyes with his fists against the brightness. Steady now, Bierson. Bierson squinted through his fingers. Director Thaman? It's always a difficult ride to sink back from Iyryl. He patted Bierson on the shoulder. But you don't have anyone to blame but yourself. I told you to let it go. Was that my skeleton? Bierson asked in a weak, trembling voice. Yes, 299. Pont. Bierson. Am I dead? Director Thaman grinned. That is a good question. The best answer I can give you is that it depends on your point of view. Director Thaman sounded like he'd had this conversation before. Riley designed the download, and it convinced him that we weren't just transferring streams of data, but our actual consciousness. To him, it was proof we were more than our bodies. Where do people go if not downloaded? Director Thaman shrugged. Another good question. One Riley had no answer to, nor did he care to know, I think. He thought it irrelevant, but he knows now. He just can't tell us. Pearson pointed a trembling finger at the screen, which was now filled with the memento mori of his grinning skull. Who are they? Were we? We are the last remnant of humanity that was. We 400 fled to this virtual world from the real one where the Gand wiped us out. Director Thaman leaned against the wall, gauging Pearson's reaction. I saw more than 400 people just walking to work today. Did you? Of course. Did you talk to them? Did you really see them? Director Thaman asked, a wan smile on his lips. I'm sure they greeted you, but did any look angry or happy or cuss you when you stepped in front of them? Can you name them? He paused, getting no immediate reply. Do you have any children, Pearson? Most people just keep to themselves, Pearson shrugged. And we've tried to have kids, but the DNA damage from the Gand left most of us sterile. I'm one of very few born to my family in years. Director Thaman nodded at the screen. None of us can have children anymore. We have all been sterilized, irreversibly. The Directorate puts those people in the background simply to relieve our collective sense of isolation, our inherent need for growth. But we aren't growing. There are no children, no new people at all, no survivors. We tried programming children, but the relationship is too intimate. No one believed. No one truly loved our computer children. Not to mention, fully programmed personalities utilize a lot of system processing. So now you only see children in the distance, belonging to someone else, running and playing, to give us hope that civilization isn't dying. In reality, there are only 395 of us biological downloads. Not 400? There are 400 skeletons out there. This whole place, in here and there, was humanity's last attempt to stave off extinction. We were supposed to download from our natural bodies into ones that would be immune to the Gand. The bioframes Dr. Koto designed rejected our downloads, hence 395. The first ones downloaded and then died in their new, glorious, spasming bodies. After the fifth attempt and subsequent death, that of my wife, Nora, we halted the process, trying from the inside to figure out what was wrong on the outside. Director Thaman fell into a dilapidated plastic chair that Pearson hadn't noticed before, his perfect suit suddenly looking wrinkled, his hair disheveled. But it was a good thing. Maybe. As it turns out, the Gand mutated and found a way to attack the bioframes anyway. There were just enough traces of humanity in them to die. Apparently the synthetic endocrine system had been reproduced too well. The virus found itself a new home. The bioframes all died within 5 real-life years. And we'd all have been dead too. Or back in here. Pearson stared at Director Thaman. How long have we been in here? Time's funny in real life compared to what we perceive inside. Those bodies died over 300 years ago. We were never supposed to be in here this long. We, the Directorate, have been trying to expand in both places, running experiments, looking for ways to build new frames of some sort. But there's just only so much processing power. It takes a lot of cycles to run a consciousness, and you've seen what it is to try to interface with the outside. Director Thaman dropped his head into his hands. We were never supposed to be here this long. I'm only 32, Pearson objected. That's what you've been programmed to remember, said Director Thaman, tapping his temple. They sat in silence for a long time. Pearson's gaze swept from the director to the peeling gray paint on the walls, to the split tile, and back to the screen. Always back to the screen, where his dead skull grinned up at him. It didn't seem to mind death. So this, Pearson waved his hand to encompass everything around him, is all some simulation? Some digital virtual world? Yes. Then why the hell is it so damn dreary? Pearson rubbed his cheeks. Can you guys spring for some flowers or a blue sky or something? Director Thaman laughed. You should see how much power pretty colors take up. Bland saves CPU cycles. Why this? Asked Pearson with no hint of laughter, hiking a thumb over his shoulder at the monitor. I mean, I guess the director keeps it all secret so everyone doesn't go crazy or kill themselves. The director nodded. But why have this out here for people to find? I've heard about the bones of Iyryl since I was a child. Pearson paused, considered, and corrected himself. I guess I should say the memories I was provided have the bones in them. And so do other people's, obviously. If it's supposed to be such a secret, why have this terminal at all? Simply put, we need it. We can't close it down or we lose access to Iyryl completely. It's hardwired and we can't disconnect it without completely destroying it. Director Thaman shrugged. So all we can do is reassign the port address. Someone eventually finds it again. Curiosity is part of our biological download. Then we have to move the terminal. It's quite a pain. You think moving a robot is difficult in Iyryl? Try programming an interface there. Pearson nodded and returned to the staring contest with his skull's dark, cavernous eye sockets. He'd talked to people who theorized that the world was not as it seemed, that everyone was just spinning their wheels in some pointless simulation. Pearson couldn't remember the guy's name, but he remembered him at the end of the party, shunned, alone in the corner, the drink in his hand his only companion. No one had cared for his ridiculous theories. Pearson wondered if the man had ever found the bones. Our jobs? Mostly busy work, Director Thaman said, except a few data mining jobs like yours. People need purpose, even if a dreary one. I think I might just take up smoking, Pearson said. It can't hurt. Pearson looked at the director and decided not to ask in what sense he meant it couldn't hurt. So there it is, Pearson. You now know the deepest, darkest secret of the directorate and the world you live in. That is what it means to be a director. To know we are trapped hopelessly in a computer that could fail any day without warning, erasing our universe and the only vestige of what humanity once was. To know and to keep going anyway. But it's also to have hope that somehow, some way, we can find an answer. Or maybe hold out for rescue. Maybe there is another secret lab out there with good frames, but need our consciousness transfer capacity. Or at least survive long enough to discover that somewhere, somehow, other humans beat the Gand. Hope against hope, while we still live. Pearson looked at the director. It's too much to believe. I don't remember any of it, not a trace. I certainly don't remember any downloading. I do remember my parents, though. But they weren't real, were they? Director Thaman shook his head. Not those parents. No one outside the directorate remembers their download or their life outside. We've blocked it. But it's all there waiting for you. Your parents. Your children. He held placating hands out as Pearson straightened in his chair. Yes, you've had children and outlived them. So have I. You have lived a whole other life before coming to what you know as Rileyton. You can know it all if you're ready to join us as a director. Do I even have a choice? Pearson glowered at Director Thaman. You don't have to kill me, delete me, or something? No, Thaman said, chuckling. You won't be harmed. We just blocked the whole affair out of your memory, and you were never here. It's a snap. I can't guarantee you won't go looking for the bones again, though. And that's the final reason we keep the terminal accessible. As a test to recruit new directors? Director Thaman nodded. Tears rolled unhindered down Pearson's face. To him the choice was already clear. One path led to a bland but comfortable workaday life with his wife and fond memories. The other way lay an abyss of hopelessness, with no hope for this world or the other. He'd only been aware of the truth for a few minutes, and he could already see that. Unblocking the memories of the before time would be to know infinite loss, since he'd already lost in the real world what he dreamed of having in this one, and knowing he'd never, ever really have the chance to get it back. I hope you won't think less of me, Director, Pearson said, fist screwing tightly against his weeping eyes, but I don't want to know. I just want to go back to the way things were. Director Thaman gave a sad little smile. No, Pearson, my friend, I completely understand. It's a hard thing. I know well. Really? Pearson was still squeezing his eyes shut. You won't be angry or anything? No, Pearson. It's what you said last time, too. I keep hoping you'll join us one day. You'd be a good director. Pearson snapped his head up. What did you just say? Director Thaman looked down at Pearson, who was sitting at the check-in desk. I said I'd like a room, please. How are you doing today, Pearson? Just fine, thank you. He shook his head as if trying to wake. Sorry, I guess I was daydreaming, Director. Happens to the best of us, Pearson, the director replied. After all, life is but a dream.